Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and welcome to another edition of our series on lost ancient civilizations, where we do our very best to expose history's greatest mysteries. You won't want to click out of this video, as we are going to be breaking down two sites in Egypt that are 537 kilometers or 333 miles from each other, but despite the distance may be the oldest, most important structures in Egypt and may have a huge connection with the pyramids, the Sphinx, the so-called mythology surrounding Osiris, and a lost ancient civilization with high technology. As many of you may be aware, we've been heavily researching the mysteries throughout the world surrounding a great ancient cataclysm for some time now. As we've broken down in great detail in past videos, nearly every single ancient civilization that has ever lived have spoken of a great flood of some kind. They've also spoken of the earth being covered in ice and fire spreading throughout the world. In recent days, we've been able to prove with science that these cataclysms did indeed occur around the period of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, which came to an abrupt end about 11,500 years ago. The last ice age was followed by a sudden warming event that seems to be perfectly tied to the extinction of 75% of all mammals in North America, including the Clovis people, mammoths, giant sloths, North American camels, North American lions, among countless other creatures that used to roam the continent. We then saw a rapid cooling event we call the Younger Dryas, followed once again about 1,300 years later by a rapid warming period. To put it simply, the Earth was chaos during this period. Hell on Earth. The floods that ravaged the planet, the fires that burned a great portion of the planet, the earthquakes, asteroids, as we've documented in places like Greenland, the suspected plasma bursts. All of this is a recipe for disaster, to put it extremely mildly. Now, what if civilizations are of a cyclical nature? What if human beings advance in construction and technology, in travel and communication, but continuously get wiped out by massive cataclysms? This hypothesis was once considered quackery, but today is getting a lot more attention as more and more information comes out that appears to debunk everything we ever thought we knew about past civilizations. We know, or at least we think we know, bits and pieces of our history going back just over 5,000 years. That is a tiny window in human history. All of those hundreds of thousands of years went by and humans didn't develop until suddenly humans developed all at once. This seems unlikely, but yet this is what we're taught in school. If a massive asteroid or comet hit the Earth today and caused an apocalyptic nuclear fallout type scenario, what would exist 12,000 years later? Stone structures? Our cars and electronics wouldn't. Metal would rust to dust for the most part, with some anomalies here and there. Glass would turn to dust. Basically, the memory of our civilization today would be gone, especially considering everything is backed up via frequency on the internet today. Good luck preserving that for the history books. Okay. I'll get to the point. We've been told that history randomly began around 3000 BC as far as civilized humanity goes. Hunter-gatherers threw down their spears and stopped eating bugs, and out of nowhere developed advanced religious beliefs and built the most amazing structures ever in human history, only to get more and more primitive in their architectural techniques and abilities as time went on. That's what we're told to believe. According to much of the academic archaeological community, that is common sense, and anyone who questions it is a fool smoking too much of something or other. Think of how backwards that is. Of course, in recent times, with the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, which is completely accepted to be from the 10th millennia, it has called into question everything that's been shoved down our throats for the last century especially. Göbekli Tepe in the Urfa province of Turkey, which I plan to research in person in the next year, is a massive site covered in T-shaped stone pillars with incredible astrological symbology. The pillars are standing in circular formation, and the site is vastly, vastly larger than Stonehenge and predates it by 7,000 years. Göbekli Tepe was built exactly around the time of the climate catastrophe during the Younger Dryas Period. It was inhabited for 2,000 years and was mysteriously buried on purpose by inhabitants around the 8th millennia. So again, let's get this straight. Primitive people who couldn't even farm allegedly built a massive stone monument, continuously burying it over and over again and building one structure on top of another for thousands of years. Decided they had enough, went back to throwing spears at each other and eating bugs for 5,000 years, and then suddenly relearned how to build things again and built the greatest monuments to ever exist. Monuments that we still can't build today. You tell me who you really think is crazy. Now I know you're probably thinking, when are you getting to the two sites that are the subject of this video? First, I must explain the context leading into these two sites because it's incredibly important and helps bring this story together. The Egyptians worshipped god Osiris. Osiris was one of the 9 original gods who appeared in Egypt during what they called the first time, also known as Zep Tepe. As the origin story goes, the land had risen from endless water. Ra, the sun god, materialized in his self-created form as Adam. Ra birthed Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut birthed Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. These two also mate and create Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys. They all became the 9 gods of Heliopolis, the most ancient and sacred city in Egypt. Ra, Shu, Geb, and Osiris were said to have ruled in Egypt as kings, followed by Horus, and then for 3,226 years, the Ibis head wisdom god, Thoth. Osiris was somewhat of an anarchist ruler, if that makes any sense. He persuaded people to follow his way of life without force. As the ancients wrote, and I quote, "Osiris forced no man to carry out his instructions, but by means of gentle persuasion and an appeal to their reason, he succeeded in inducing them to practice what he preached. Many of his wise counsels were imparted to his listeners in hymns and songs, which were sung to the accompaniment of instruments of music." Osiris quit his so-called reign over Egypt for many years, handing control of the kingdom to his sister and lover, Isis, as Diodorus Siculus was told, visited all the inhabited earth and taught the race of men how to cultivate the vine and sow wheat and barley, for he supposed that if he made men give up their savagery and adopt a gentle manner of life, he would receive immortal honors because of the magnitude of his benefactions. Interestingly, the Incas, Mayans, and Aztecs tell an incredibly similar story of a light-skinned man in a robe with a beard, as many described Osiris coming from the east over the ocean to them in the west. They called him Viracocha or Quetzalcoatl. He taught civility, cured them of their barbarous ways, taught them to stop sacrificing people for a short period, taught them architecture and language, and showed them how to cultivate. Isn't it interesting that both the Egyptians, the Mayans, Olmecs, Aztecs, and Incas all speak of this being doing the same things in a time of great antiquity? All of these cultures, despite being on other sides of the planet, also speak of a great flood, wiping out all of civilization. How did these much more recent cultures know of this event, and how do they all have such similar stories? For those who want to know more about these similarities, I highly recommend you check out our video called Ancient Cataclysm According to the Ancients. But first, let's get to those incredibly important Egyptian sites I brought up at the beginning of the video. I've been wanting to do a video on these sites for quite some time after being heavily influenced by Graham Hancock's book, Fingerprints of the Gods, and Robert Schoch and Robert Bauval's book, Origins of the Sphinx. What if Osiris was a real person? What if his existence and the existence of the other gods of the first time simply became legend as their stories were passed down over history? The inventory stela, an ancient Egyptian stela detailing the history of Egypt, talks about a temple. This temple is spoken of as being of great antiquity. They called it the Temple of Osiris or House of Osiris. It was located closely in front of the Sphinx. The Egyptians spoke of it as though the dynastic Egyptians found it alongside the Sphinx. They speak of it as standing in the time of Khufu, father of Khafre. Interestingly, the pyramid texts, which detail a history likely handed down and recited countless times throughout ancient Egypt, also speaks of the same thing. The House of Osiris, later known as the Sphinx Temple and currently today known as the Valley Temple of Khafre, is an anomaly. The Valley Temple is almost perfectly oriented north to south with an error of just 12 arc minutes. The temple is 147 feet along each side. It was built into the slope of the plateau, which was higher in the west than in the east. For this reason, while its western wall stood only a little over 20 feet tall, its eastern wall exceeded 40 feet. The Valley Temple's core structure was built entirely of gigantic limestone megaliths. The majority of these measured about 18 feet long by 10 feet wide and 8 feet high. Some were as large as 30 feet long by 12 feet wide and 10 feet high. The blocks averaged out at 200 tons, and there were hundreds of these blocks. The scale is absolutely incredible. It begs the question, why not just cut these 200-ton blocks into 20-ton blocks or 5-ton blocks to come to generally the same result? What was the point of lifting these impossibly large stones as high as 40 feet? It reminds one of the impossibly large stones in the Great Pyramid lifted impossibly high. Now, I shouldn't say impossible so much as obviously it was possible because it happened, but it's so incredibly mind-boggling, especially if you believe the official narrative that these people were primitive, quote unquote, and then suddenly decided to build these incredible monuments. The Valley Temple has no inscriptions, which is odd for dynastic Egypt. It stands alone with only a few other important sites in Egypt, including the Osireion in Abydos, which is the second site we will go into in a moment, and the Great Pyramid, which carries no inscriptions other than a debatable inscription of Khufu found by a failed, overfunded archaeologist who was about to get funding pulled after years of finding nothing. I don't consider this evidence but clear forgery. So surely, Egyptologists had a good reason to call the Valley Temple a Temple of Khafre despite the ancient Egyptians calling it the Temple of Osiris, right? Well, unfortunately, the Egyptological community have a thing for playing Simon Says. For most of the 18th century, the Valley Temple of Khafre was thought to have been built in far more remote antiquity, predating dynastic Egypt, having nothing to do with the common architecture. This notion was changed when small, life-size inscribed statues of Khafre were found buried within the temple precincts. The discovery of the statues led Egyptologists to assume that, of course, if there are statues in the Valley Temple of Khafre, then the temple must be Khafre's. Why not? What should concern you is that this is basically all the proof they had, and this is a major reason why they dated the Sphinx to Khafre as well. We will get into the Sphinx later. Flinders Petrie once said, and I quote, "The fact that the only datable remains found in the temple were statues of Khafre shows that it is of his period, since the idea of his appropriating an earlier building is very unlikely," end quote. Why on earth is it unlikely? Countless pharaohs appropriated the buildings of their predecessors, sometimes deliberately striking out the cartouches of the original builders and replacing them with their own. Why wouldn't Khafre have appropriated a temple in such an important place that was not claimed by anyone but legends of the gods of great antiquity? As Graham Hancock points out in Fingerprints of the Gods, and I quote, "In such a place of archaic and mysterious power, which he does not appear to have interfered with in any other way, Khafre might have thought that the setting up of beautiful and lifelike statues of himself could bring eternal benefits. And if among the gods the Valley Temple had been associated with Osiris, whom it was every pharaoh's objective to join in the afterlife, Khafre's use of statues to forge a strong symbolic link would be even more understandable," end quote. But of course, it seems obvious. If any evidence of the hand of Khafre, it's that he renovated the site. Again, the inventory stela clearly noted that it was standing in the time of Khufu, Khafre's father. The stela claimed it was a remotely ancient building. It was believed to have come from the so-called first time and built by the gods who settled the Nile Valley in the remote epoch. Something that may shock you about the Valley Temple is that we see clear evidence of water erosion on the inner wall. This could not have happened in the past 5,000 years of desert climate. Interestingly enough, the Sahara Desert used to be a jungle until in a very short amount of time, it radically changed into a desert. Worth noting is that the sand of the Sahara is said to have originally come from the ocean. Must have been a pretty incredible inundation for that to happen if true. Similar to Machu Picchu, the massive stones in the Valley Temple in many cases were fitted into jigsaw-like fittings with multi-edge polygonal cuts. This is a correlation that we will go into later on in the video relating to the second site we will detail, the Osireion. The Valley Temple was built in 2 stages. The beautiful exterior wall had mostly fallen, but on close inspection, the exterior wall that remains shows that during its placing, the back of the granite rocks were cut to fit into the eroded limestone inner walls as if the wall had been standing for many thousands of years before the dynastics renovated it and fit more polished stones into the already eroded structure. They cut grooves to fit the eroded features. This is yet again further evidence that proves the Valley Temple is dramatically old. So what was the purpose of the Valley Temple? Historians have a really strange way of simplifying literally everything to fit a narrative. Most historians will have you believe that literally all ancient structures were tombs or temples of some kind. Now, at one point, many of them could have been utilized as temples, especially if they were considered sacred and ancient to the ancient Egyptians in this case. But does anyone ever consider that perhaps the Egyptians or the Mayans or the Incas or the Olmecs or the Aztecs or the Indonesians or the Turks or the Babylonians may have built incredible structures for functional purposes? I mean, it was found in recent days that the Great Pyramid can actually concentrate electromagnetic energy. And like the Valley Temple and the Osireion, no mummy has ever been found inside. There are no inscriptions, and they are mathematically perfectly built to the stars. There are also countless tunnels and causeways around the sites that should probably be more closely researched. There's absolutely no evidence that the pyramids were tombs. Built to mathematical pi and phi connected to Orion's belt, where according to the ancients is where Osiris came from, and perfectly in tune with the night sky in the year 10,450 BC somehow. The written history of the site is completely based on assumption and passed down word of mouth, settled on for the sake of comfort. I'm getting off track here, but it's just so frustrating to see what the mainstream says matter-of-factly with next to no evidence, and the amount of careers ruined for simply questioning this regurgitated mythology. And yes, I consider what the mainstream academics say mythology, because they look at things with a far more assumptive, almost religious nature than those of us truly questioning things and being skeptical. Questioning narratives is how we find answers, and there is no more mysterious place than Egypt, spare a few places in the Americas and Babylon, or perhaps Mauritania, where I'll be heading soon. Anyways, Edward Bravarsky, an Egyptologist at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, suggests that the doors of the Valley Temple represent the doors of heaven mentioned in the pyramid texts, which are said to lead the dead into the afterlife. Bravarsky also claims the Valley Temple is to be seen as a place of purification where the corpse of the king was washed and prepared for mummification. While often repeated, the ancient Egyptians never made any such claim, and the notion is completely pulled from thin air by modern academics. But once again, if you repeat something enough times, eventually people will believe it. It is believed that the Valley Temple was built from stones taken from the ground in the building of the Sphinx. I can buy that. It seems to be the most likely scenario. But of course, as geologist Robert Schoch has shown, the Sphinx itself is likely to date back to around the last ice age. Water erosion on the enclosure and on the body show that this massive statue is far older than believed. But stubborn mainstream archaeologists that don't want their paradigm changed for the sake of being right have adamantly denied this. But how could the water erosion have gotten there through thousands of years in a dry desert? It would take thousands of years of rainfall to create such erosion. Interestingly, for the majority of the Sphinx's lifespan, only the head was above sand. Weirdly, despite its exposure to the elements, the head is the least decayed, least eroded feature of the Sphinx. Also interestingly, the head was clearly carved down from the original, likely modeled after Khufu rather than Khafre, which the mainstream believe, considering facial features. The stela between the Sphinx's paws, which were heavily renovated over the years with brick and casing stones, talks about Khafre but does not clearly say that he built the Sphinx, only that he benefited the Sphinx in some way or another, insinuating that he renovated the site. This makes far more sense considering basic geology. The inventory stela and the pyramid texts also seem to allude to the same conclusion. Besides, why would the dynastic Egyptians build the Sphinx in ground knowing that it would be next to impossible to keep the Sphinx from being buried to the neck in sand within a decade? The dynastic Egyptians may not have built the Sphinx, but they were smart enough not to do something so foolish as to build a monument that would be so prone to the sands of the desert. Egyptians considered the Sphinx itself vastly old, guarding the splendid place of the beginning of all time, staring blankly due east. In 1904, Wallace Budge, the keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, said this, and I quote, "The oldest and finest human-headed lion statue is the famous Sphinx at Giza. This marvelous object was in existence in the days of Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid, and was most probably very old even at that early period. The Sphinx was thought to be connected in some way with foreigners or with a foreign religion which dated from pre-dynastic times." Funny how fast a narrative can change. That brings me to the Osireion in Abydos. Once considered by the mainstream to be the oldest site in Egypt, it's one of the only sites in Egypt similar architecturally to the Valley Temple. They appear to clearly have been built by the same people. One thing that will stand out to anyone that goes to Abydos, according to most researchers and a simple Google search, is that the Osireion stands out architecturally from the Temple of Seti I next door. Mainstream archaeologists will claim that both structures were built by the same people at the same time, but the difference in architecture is extraordinarily different. It's also worth mentioning that the Osireion is located 50 feet below the level of the floor of the Seti I temple. It seems highly unlikely that this was by design. The temple of Seti I was dedicated to Osiris and was known to the ancients as the house of millions of years. Greek geographer Strabo said of the Osireion, "It is a remarkable structure built of solid stone containing galleries made of monoliths of surpassing size and workmanship. There is a canal leading to the place from the great river." Now, over the centuries that followed, sand and water buried the Osireion, and people forgot about it. The site became legend known as Strabo's Well. In 1903, about 200 feet west of the Temple of Seti I, the Osireion was partially discovered by Flinders Petrie and Margaret Murray. In 1912, they finally began to excavate the site under the direction of Professor Naville of the Egypt Exploration Fund. Naville said the following, and I quote, "What we discovered is a gigantic construction of about 100 feet in length and 60 in width, built with the most enormous stones that may be seen in Egypt. In the four sides of the enclosure walls are cells, 17 in number, of the height of a man and without ornamentation of any kind. The building itself is divided into 3 naves, the middle one being wider than those of the sides. The division is produced by 2 colonnades made of huge granite monoliths supporting architraves of equal size." Naville also noted finding one block more than 25 feet long. The cells cut into the enclosure walls had no floors and were in fact deep holes filled with moist sand and earth. Naville also noted, and I quote, "The cells are connected by a narrow ledge between 2 and 3 feet wide. There is a ledge also on the opposite side of the nave, but no floor at all. And in digging to a depth of 12 feet, we reached infiltrated water. Even below the Great Gateway, there is no floor, and when there was water in front of it, the cells were probably reached with a small boat." End quote. The Osireion was constantly inundated with water, though about a 19-minute walk from a runoff of the Nile. It is very unlikely to believe that the Osireion was constructed in deep water. There are 2 massive colonnades on the plinth that consist of 5 huge rose-colored granite monoliths about 8 feet square by 12 feet high and weighing around 100 tons. The top of these massive columns were spanned by granite lintels, and there's evidence that the whole building once had been roofed over with a series of even larger monolithic slabs. This is even more alarming of a mystery when you consider the stones came from the Aswan quarry 324 kilometers or 201 miles away. How in the bloody hell is that even considered possible? And why? It simply doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they, like I mentioned earlier, just cut them into smaller pieces? The sandstone plinth formed a rectangular island surrounded on all 4 sides by a water-filled moat about 10 feet wide. The moat was contained by an immense rectangular enclosure wall around 20 feet thick, perhaps larger, made of very large blocks of red sandstone cut in polygonal jigsaw puzzle patterns. Here again, we see the jigsaw pattern like at the Valley Temple or in Machu Picchu, Cusco, and elsewhere. Built to stand the test of time, survive earthquakes, and other cataclysms. Professor Naville said the following, and I quote, "The monument raises several important questions. As to its date, its great similarity with the Temple of the Sphinx, as the Valley Temple was then known, shows it to be of the same epoch when buildings were made with enormous stones without any ornament. This is characteristic of the oldest architecture in Egypt. I should even say that we may call it the most ancient stone building in Egypt." Naville believed that the Osireion was utilized for functional purposes as a large reservoir where water was stored during the High Nile. He didn't believe it to be a temple or a tomb, but instead a waterwork. Well, as Egypt history goes, that notion was deep-sixed. While Naville believed it to be the oldest structure in Egypt, after the war stifled further research, it was continued in 1925 by the young Henry Frankfurt. Frankfurt believed, since he found a cartouche of Seti and a broken potsherd in the entrance passage bearing the legend Seti is serviceable to Osiris, that this then meant that the Osireion was therefore built by Seti, much like a buried statue at the Valley Temple led them to believe it was built by Khafre, or a small, very possibly forged inscription at the Great Pyramid meant it was built by Khufu. One person makes a claim and then it's forever repeated as fact without any actual evidence. The inscription at the Temple of Seti I could easily be seen as Seti saying he was serviceable to Osiris by renovating the site. Pharaohs loved to put their names on things, and the Osireion and Seti temple was otherwise anonymous. It's hard to believe a dynastic built something like the Great Pyramid, the Valley Temple, or the Osireion and didn't put their name on it somewhere. Or, I don't know, decorate it at all for that matter. They build these incredible structures and just never write on it? Temples and tombs are supposed to be sacred to the dynastic Egyptians. The hieroglyphs were meant to guide the dead to the afterlife. It was a very important part of their religion and culture. To wave off such an obvious fact is to laugh in the face of reason. To top it all off, the paintings and inscriptions that are near the site, including the ones Frankfurt found, were outside the 20-foot thick enclosure wall, which defines the huge undecorated megalithic core of the building. Could it be that chambers were built after the fact around a sacred site like the Osireion? I mean, as was just discovered in the past month, an ancient palace built by Ramses II was found close to the Osireion to the north with great inscriptions. Of course, Ramses II was the son of Seti I. He was the pharaoh famous for the biblical Exodus. He put his face on everything. You can see statues of him at Abu Simbel. He and his father, Seti, liked to embellish upon their own reputations, and we are supposed to believe that Seti built the Osireion and didn't make a single freaking inscription? It's a little infuriating to think that I'm the one that's considered crazy for asking seriously reasonable questions. Margaret Murray wrote the following about the Osireion, and I quote, "It was made for the celebration of the mysteries of Osiris, and so far is unique among all the surviving buildings of Egypt. It is clearly early, for the great blocks of which it is built are of the style of the Old Kingdom. The simplicity of the actual building also points to it being of that early date. The decoration was added by Seti I, who in that way laid claim to the building. But seeing how often a pharaoh claimed the work of his predecessors by putting his name on it, this fact does not carry much weight. It is the style of the building, the type of the masonry, the tooling of the stone, and not the name of a king which date a building in Egypt," end quote. Back in 1991, there was an incredible discovery near Abydos. About a kilometer northwest of the Osireion, 8 miles from the Nile, a bunch of wooden royal ships were found. They were considered to be built simply as an ode to the god Osiris to carry him through the celestial sea of the universe. Why? Well, some guy said so at some point, apparently. The boats were designed incredibly well, as were the boats in far better condition found near the pyramids at Giza. The Egyptians themselves claimed they had once been great seasteaders. Unfortunately, today this notion is greatly denied, but the evidence remains in the form of many boats found in Egypt that appear to have been built perfectly functionally. Many of which are designed almost the exact same way, interestingly, as the heirloom design of boats on what was once the shoreline of Lake Titicaca on the other side of the world by Pumapunku and the more recent Tiwanaku. There's one more thing, however, that I want to note about the Osireion, and I alluded to it earlier when talking about the Valley Temple. There are stones in the Osireion that have mysterious notches in them. These notches are very similar to the notches in the casing stones of the so-called Third Pyramid of Menkaure. Many consider this to be evidence that the casing stones were unfinished, but that seems like a rather strange assumption. It starts to draw out more questions when you consider that these notches in stonework can also be found in Cusco, Peru, on the other side of the world. Another place you can find perfectly fitted jigsaw-like polygonal rockwork. Were those stones unfinished too? And this brings it full circle. Were these civilizations connected? There are minor differences in their architecture, which tells me that while they may not have been directly connected, they were definitely influenced by a common source, whose ideology and influence was handed down and slowly watered down over the centuries and millennia that followed. Could civilizations throughout the world have been linked? Could they have had great technologies that we today simply cannot comprehend? We see the results, but we don't see the technology itself. Could it be that there were vast ancient civilizations that were wiped out and we only see small remnants today, as well as stories passed down through generations? Could literally every single ancient civilization have been right in saying a great catastrophe or flood wiped out their more advanced, so-called godly ancestors? Could this play into the story of ancient Noah and his ark, or the epics of Gilgamesh? Osiris, like Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl in the Americas, ruled at a time of great uncertainty in a vastly ancient epoch. Incredible and mysterious structures were built in their honor. Some are said to have been built in their time. All of these ancient civilizations worshipped great gods that lived before them. All of these gods were similar. They all were related to snakes and reptiles. They all seemed to carry the same bags, whether carved into rock in Egypt, in Peru or Bolivia, in Mexico, or even on T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, which allegedly predates all of these former sites by 7,000 or more years, dating back to the ancient cataclysm itself. Then relate all of this to the story of Atlantis that Plato recounted from his relative Solon. And before you say Plato made it up, explain how Herodotus drew a map 3 years before Plato was born showing Atlantis around the region of Mauritania. We thought the ancient city of Troy was a myth for thousands of years, until we found it. Who's to say Atlantis didn't exist? The ancient Egyptians claimed their society came from Atlantis. That would explain the ancient water-eroded Sphinx, the Temple of Osiris, known as the Valley Temple, the Osireion, the incredible structures in the Americas that the ancient Mayans, Incas, and Aztecs claimed were built by far more ancient generations. It would explain the biblical Genesis flood, the epics of Gilgamesh, the ancient flood spoken of by the Egyptians, the Indians, the Native Americans, the Chinese, and basically every other culture and civilization. It would explain these so-called gods as simply technologically advanced leaders who attempted to spread their knowledge to future generations after the Great Cataclysm. It would explain how the Mayans and the Egyptians both understood longitude and latitude to such a great degree when modern people only really figured it out in the past 2 centuries. It would explain the mathematical advancement and astrological knowledge of the ancients. It would explain Göbekli Tepe and the fact that the Great Pyramid is modeled to the sky in 10,450 BC somehow, as the Earth is on a constant 26,000 year precession as Orion's belt moves up and down in the sky every 13,000 years. It would explain the ancient cataclysm that we know happened around that exact period of time, as massive amounts of mammals were wiped off the face of the planet at the same time. Man, I could go on all day, but then you find out that the Eye of the Sahara, also known as the Reshat structure in Mauritania, near the Atlas Mountains and the Atlas Sea, where King Atlas once reigned in mythology, perfectly fits the description by Plato of Atlantis, also translated as the island of Atlas. 23.5 kilometers across the main section, concentric circles, mountains to the north with ancient rivers, exits to the south, tectonic plates having pushed up that piece of land over the millennia, seashells littering the ground, all the way up to the mountain range where the Rishat structure, also known as Guelb el Rishat, sits, watching the sky like the eye of Horus. People in the region carry necklaces of eyeballs and have an ancient history of being superstitious of the evil eye. Interesting that Horus brought about a great cataclysm as revenge for the crucifixion of his father Osiris. Also interesting to point out that King Atlas was of a set of twins, his brother being Chaldees, the former name of Spain to the north above the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. I cannot mention that without mentioning that this part of Africa is the most common place to find twins in the world. And I cannot mention that without mentioning that Egyptian sun god Ra's firstborn, Shu and Tefnut, were twins. Something is going on, and I don't know what it is. I don't know who benefits. I just know that the true origin of history is not understood. The true origin of human civilization is unknown. Anytime anyone attempts to expose it, they have been ignored and laughed at. Sometimes their careers are completely destroyed. Are there people that don't want us to know the truth? Or is it that the community is far too stubborn to open their minds to new possibilities because it would mean that their entire life's work was false, that they were wrong all along? It's easier to be comfortable in your ignorance than admit you were wrong. When I found out that no one has done any comprehensive work at the Rishat structure, I knew I had to go. Seriously, I'm an amateur, but it's better an amateur than no one at all. We will be doing tests at the Rishat structure soon to find out what really stood there 12,000 plus years ago. While it's not safe to tell all of you when exactly I'm heading there, I do ask all of you to please help me if you can with funding this trip. It's a historic trip, and my curiosity got the best of me before I realized how much it was costing me. When I make promises, I stick to them, even if it stupidly gets me killed. But only risk takers make discoveries, and I refuse to sit at home when there's so much to explore and expose in this world. I will be documenting the whole journey and bringing back 4K footage. I'm doing a documentary on the journey, and I can't do it without you. Please help us make this trip as stressless as possible. YouTube has been shadow banning us to death lately, and it's becoming more and more impossible to do this full time after 6 years of running this channel. We are reaching, on average, less people today than we did when we had 10% of the subscribers. It's getting bad. We will be going to Göbekli Tepe and Iraq in the next year as well to study ancient sites. And if you're interested in seeing this stuff documented like never before, you can check out our Subscribestar page, our GoFundMe, our Bitcoin address, which I'll put on the screen here for you to scan if you please, and of course, Patreon. All of the above is linked below, and we will have an outro that will go over much of this again, but if I don't put it out there, I'm not making enough of an effort to get the help necessary to shine light in the darkest of places. As I close this off, make sure to check out our Ancient Civilizations playlist, subscribe to our channel, press like on this video, and all that stuff as it helps us stick to the algo. I want to thank researcher Brian Forrester for his incredible work digging into lost ancient technology and documenting so many incredible sites around the world. If you haven't checked him out already, you should. We've interviewed him twice, and he's a wealth of knowledge. Also, a big shout out to Jimmy from Bright Insight for his absolutely incredible breakdowns of lost ancient civilizations. He seriously deserves so much credit for bringing these issues to light in a way especially young people can relate to. As for this report, I couldn't go without saying thank you to Graham Hancock, Robert Schock, and Robert Baval, as I utilized information they originally documented so thoroughly in the books Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, and Origins of the Sphinx in this particular report. they should get the praise. I can't wait to read Hancock's latest book, America Before, which I pre-ordered a couple of months ago. I'm looking forward to digging into ancient America a bit in the next year, as well as I may be doing a trip through Mexico, and considering my close proximity to Arizona here in Nevada, I may have to check out a few sites there as well. This video has gone on way too long, so thank you to everyone that stuck around. I will be doing many more videos on ancient civilizations, so stay tuned for my documentary on Atlantis, and wish me luck. I'll need it. We have been misled dramatically when it comes to the true origins of human civilizations, and it's time to make the so-called fringe mainstream. Logic always wins, eventually. The truth cannot be hidden forever. Stay tuned for more from Wham! This is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change. Like what you see here, Wham? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so heavily demonetized and censored by YouTube, as these guys come in and flag all of our content as hate speech. The shadow banning is getting really bad, guys. Also, check our Bitcoin address right here on the screen or in the description below. We really appreciate it. And of course, check us out at the Red Pill Expo 2019. Of course, the great G. Edward Griffin and so many other incredible speakers will be there. Our link for that is below as well. And we cannot forget Mike Maloney's goldsilver.com, which you can also find in the description. One of the greatest market and monetary historians out there. We really encourage everyone to check that out. But until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.